Stop explaining yourself to demons and people. Bible wisdom. In a noisy world where everyone rushes to defend themselves, what if I told you that silence could be your most powerful weapon? Welcome to Stop Explaining Yourself to Demons and People. Well, Bible wisdom, where we'll uncover a truth that most believers have overlooked. Have you ever found yourself exhausted from constantly explaining your actions, your decisions, your very existence to people who seem determined to misunderstand you? You're not alone. Every day, countless chosen ones waste their precious spiritual energy defending themselves to those who can't or won't understand. But what if I told you that Jesus himself demonstrated a profound strategy for handling such situations? What if the very act of explaining yourself is actually diminishing your spiritual authority? In today's message, I'm going to reveal something that will transform how you handle opposition and criticism forever. This isn't just another teaching about spiritual warfare. This is about understanding a divine principle that Jesus demonstrated before Pilate, a wisdom that Mary Magdalene experienced firsthand, and a truth that C.S. Lewis articulated with remarkable clarity. What makes this message unique is that it connects ancient biblical wisdom with the modern battles you're facing right now, in your workplace, your relationships, and even your ministry. By the end of this video, you'll understand why silence is actually a language of power. How to discern when explaining yourself becomes a spiritual vulnerability. A biblical strategy for preserving your peace and authority. Practical steps to rise above the noise and win battles without saying a word. Are you currently dealing with people who constantly twist your words or misunderstand your intentions? If this resonates with your spirit, type silence in the comments below. Let's build a community of believers who understand the power of strategic silence. Let's dive deep into this transformative truth. Trust me, after this message, you'll never feel compelled to defend yourself unnecessarily again. Part 1. Understanding the spiritual battlefield. Have you ever wondered why some conversations feel like you're fighting an invisible battle? Why certain people seem to twist every word you say, no matter how clearly you explain yourself? What if I told you that, in many of these situations, you're not just dealing with the person standing in front of you? Let me take you back to a powerful moment in biblical history, the story of Mary Magdalene. In Luke 8:2, we learn that before her transformation, Mary had 7 demons dwelling within her. Imagine, for a moment, the complexity of that spiritual reality. Here was a woman, created in God's image, yet influenced by 7 distinct demonic entities, each with its own agenda, personality, and destructive purpose. The streets of Magdala, her hometown, would have known her well. Picture the scene. A woman, perhaps outwardly successful but inwardly tormented. When people spoke to Mary, they weren't just interacting with one person. They were unknowingly engaging with 8 distinct personalities. Mary herself and the 7 demons that had taken residence within her. The spiritual battlefield was right there, hidden in plain sight, in what appeared to be just another human interaction. This ancient story illuminates a profound truth that the Apostle Paul would later articulate in Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Paul, writing from a Roman prison, understood this reality intimately. The chains that bound him were physical, but the real battle he fought was spiritual. Think about your own experiences. Have you ever been in a conversation where the other person's reaction seemed disproportionate to what was actually said, where simple words sparked inexplicable hostility? This is where we need to understand the deeper dynamics at play. Just as in Mary's case, when we engage with someone influenced by demonic forces, we're not just talking to one person. We're interacting with every spirit operating within them. C.S. Lewis, in his profound wisdom, described this reality in the Screwtape Letters when he wrote, "There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. This balanced perspective is crucial for understanding our spiritual battlefield." Consider the story of Jesus encountering the demon-possessed man in Mark 5. When Jesus approached, the demons immediately recognized his authority and tried to engage him in conversation. But notice Jesus' response. He didn't get drawn into a dialogue with the demons. He commanded them with authority. This wasn't just a historical event. It was a masterclass in spiritual warfare. The reality is that demons gather information through our words. They're not omniscient like God. They learn about us through what we reveal. Every time you feel compelled to explain yourself to someone who's spiritually compromised, you might be unknowingly providing ammunition that can be used against you later. It's like handing your opponent your battle plans before the fight begins. But here's where hope enters our story. Just as Mary Magdalene was completely transformed through her encounter with Jesus, becoming one of his most devoted followers and the first witness to his resurrection, we too have access to this transformative power. The same authority that Jesus demonstrated is available to believers today through his name and his blood. The key is recognizing when we're dealing with spiritual opposition rather than mere human misunderstanding. This discernment changes everything: how we respond, when we speak, and most importantly, when we choose to remain silent. Now that we understand the true nature of our battlefield, let's explore why our natural instinct to explain ourselves might actually be weakening our spiritual position. The story of Eve's conversation with the serpent holds a crucial lesson for us all. Part 2. The danger of oversharing. Have you ever wondered why some of your most heartfelt explanations fall on deaf ears? Why do certain people seem to twist every word you speak, no matter how carefully you choose them? And what if I told you that this pattern was first revealed in the most ancient of spiritual battles? Let's journey back to the Garden of Eden, where humanity's first devastating encounter with spiritual manipulation took place. Picture this: a perfect garden, created by God himself, where every tree bore fruit except one, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In this paradise, Eve walked in perfect communion with God, understanding his clear command, "Do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." But here's where the danger of oversharing first manifested itself. The serpent, described in Genesis as more cunning than any other creature, approached Eve with a seemingly innocent question. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Notice the subtle distortion in his query, a masterful manipulation tactic that still operates today. Instead of maintaining silence or simply stating God's command, Eve began to explain. She elaborated on God's instructions, adding her own interpretation. We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, "You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." In that moment of explanation, Eve opened a door that would change humanity forever. You see, the serpent wasn't seeking understanding. He was gathering ammunition. With each word Eve spoke, he gained more insight into her uncertainties, her vulnerabilities. The very act of explaining gave him the leverage he needed to plant seeds of doubt. You will not certainly die, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. This ancient pattern repeats itself in our lives today. When we feel compelled to defend ourselves to people who are spiritually compromised, we often find ourselves in Eve's position, giving away precious information that can be twisted and used against us. C.S. Lewis, in his profound wisdom, observed this strategy of the enemy when he wrote, "Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one. The gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without sudden turnings, without signposts, Consider how this plays out in your own life. Perhaps you've experienced it in a workplace situation where every attempt to explain yourself to a toxic colleague only seems to provide them with more material for manipulation. Or maybe you've encountered it in personal relationships, where your heartfelt explanations are consistently twisted and used as weapons against you. The spiritual principle at work here is profound. When we overshare with those who are influenced by darkness, we're not just talking to the person. We're providing intelligence to every spirit operating through them. Just as Eve's conversation with the serpent wasn't merely a dialogue with a creature, but an engagement with Satan himself, our excessive explanations to spiritually compromised individuals can become gateways for demonic manipulation. But here's the transformative truth. You don't owe everyone an explanation. Jesus himself demonstrated this when he stood before his accusers. When false witnesses brought charges against him, Matthew 27:12-14 tells us when he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Why did Jesus remain silent? Because he understood a principle that we must grasp today. Not every accusation deserves a response, and not every person deserves an explanation. His silence wasn't weakness. It was divine wisdom in action. As we understand this truth, we begin to see how oversharing can deplete our spiritual energy and compromise our authority. Think about it. How much stronger would you feel if you stopped explaining yourself to those who are determined to misunderstand you? How much more peace would you experience if you learned to discern when silence is your most powerful response? This brings us to a crucial question. How do we discern when to speak and when to remain silent? As we move forward, we'll explore Jesus' profound teaching about not casting pearls before swine, a principle that will revolutionize how you handle opposition and preserve your spiritual authority. Remember, your words carry power, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose not to share them at all. Let that truth sink deep into your spirit as we continue this journey of understanding. But before we explore how to implement this wisdom in our daily lives, we need to understand exactly what Jesus meant when he warned about casting pearls before swine. His teaching reveals a profound strategy for protecting what's sacred in our lives. Part 3. Jesus' teaching on sacred wisdom. Have you ever wondered why Jesus, the greatest teacher who ever lived, sometimes chose to remain silent in the face of accusations? What if I told you that his silence wasn't just a personal choice, but a profound teaching about spiritual wisdom? And what deeper truth was he revealing when he warned us about casting pearls before swine? Let's journey back to one of the most dramatic moments in history, Jesus standing before Pilate. Picture the scene. It's early morning in Jerusalem, the air thick with tension. The religious leaders have dragged Jesus to the Roman governor's palace, the Praetorium. The same crowds that had shouted Hosanna just days before are now crying for his blood. Pilate, a man known for his brutal efficiency in maintaining Roman order, sits in judgment. The accusations are flying. The religious leaders are shouting, their voices echoing off the stone walls. They're throwing every charge they can think of: sedition, blasphemy, claiming to be a king. But what does Jesus do? Matthew 27:14 tells us something remarkable. He gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. This wasn't the silence of defeat. This wasn't the quiet of someone who had no defense. This was the silence of divine authority. Think about it. Jesus, who had confounded the wisest scholars since he was 12, who had silenced the Pharisees with his wisdom, who had taught multitudes with unparalleled authority, chose to say nothing. But why? Why? The answer lies in another teaching Jesus gave earlier in his ministry. In Matthew 7:6, he said something that might seem harsh at first. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls before swine. If you do, They may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. To understand this teaching, we need to grasp the cultural context. In first-century Jewish culture, dogs weren't the beloved pets we know today. They were considered unclean scavengers. Pigs were even worse. They were the epitome of uncleanliness for Jews. Jesus wasn't insulting people. He was using powerful metaphors his audience would immediately understand. The pearls he spoke of weren't just literal pearls. In ancient Middle Eastern culture, pearls were among the most precious possessions one could have. Merchants would sell everything they owned to acquire just one perfect pearl. These pearls, Jesus spoke of, represent the sacred truths, divine wisdom, and spiritual authority God has entrusted to you. Consider this. A pearl forms when an oyster takes something that causes irritation, a grain of sand, and transforms it into something beautiful. Similarly, the wisdom God gives you often comes through trials and challenges. It's precious, it's costly. And Jesus is saying there are times when sharing this precious wisdom with certain people is not just futile, it's dangerous. When Jesus stood before Pilate, he wasn't just demonstrating passive resistance. He was living out his own teaching. Pilate, despite his position of worldly authority, wasn't spiritually prepared to receive the truth Jesus carried. Any explanation would have been like casting pearls before swine, not because Pilate was worthless, but because he wasn't ready to receive the truth. This brings us to a profound realization. Sometimes, our instinct to explain ourselves, to defend our actions, to justify our decisions, especially to those who are spiritually opposed to us, can actually diminish the power of the truth we carry. Just as a pearl cast before swine loses none of its value but risks destruction, your truth remains true whether others acknowledge it or not. Jesus' silence before Pilate wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. It wasn't surrender, it was strength. And it teaches us something crucial about handling opposition. Not every accusation requires a response. Not every criticism demands an explanation. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is remain silent and let God vindicate you. As we transition into understanding how to apply this wisdom in our daily lives, remember this: your pearls, your God-given wisdom, your spiritual authority, your divine purpose, are too precious to be carelessly thrown before those who can't recognize their value. Sometimes, silence isn't just an option, it's a divine strategy. Think about your own life right now. Are there situations where you've been frantically trying to explain yourself to people who are spiritually unprepared to understand? Could it be that God is calling you to embrace the power of sacred silence? Let's explore how to discern these moments and stand firm in this divine wisdom. Part 4. Practical application. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where every word you speak seems to make things worse? Where explaining yourself only leads to deeper misunderstandings? What if I told you that Jesus faced similar situations and left us a perfect blueprint for handling them? Let me share a powerful story from the early days of my ministry that perfectly illustrates this principle. Picture a Wednesday evening service in a small church in downtown Manhattan. Sarah, a devoted church member and successful business executive, approached me with tears streaming down her face. Her workplace had become a battlefield of accusations and misunderstandings. Despite her best efforts to explain herself, her words were consistently twisted and used against her. The more she defended herself, the deeper she sank into emotional and spiritual exhaustion. This situation mirrors a profound moment in biblical history when Jesus stood before Pilate. Matthew 27:11. 14 presents a scene that many of us overlook in its significance. Here was Jesus, the Word made flesh, choosing deliberate silence in the face of false accusations. The Roman governor, representing the most powerful empire on earth, demanded explanations. Yet Jesus gave him no answer, not even to a single charge. Matthew 27:14. Consider the weight of this moment. The Son of God, who could have called legions of angels to his defense, who could have spoken words to shake the very foundations of Jerusalem, chose silence. This wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of divine strategy. But why? The answer lies in understanding the spiritual dynamics at play. Just as in Jesus' time, many conflicts we face today aren't merely human disagreements. They're spiritual battlegrounds. When someone is operating under the influence of spiritual darkness, their ability to receive truth becomes compromised. It's like trying to reason with a radio that's tuned to the wrong frequency. The problem isn't with your message, but with the receiver's ability to tune in. Let me share how Sarah applied this wisdom. Instead of continuing her pattern of exhaustive explanations, she adopted 3 strategic practices. 1. The discernment pause. Before responding to any accusation, she learned to pause and discern the spiritual nature of the opposition. Was this a genuine misunderstanding that needed clarification, or was she dealing with spiritual resistance, 2. The authority stance. When faced with twisted words or malicious interpretations, she remembered Jesus' example before Pilate. Instead of defending herself, she stood in her God-given authority through dignified silence. 3. The prayer pivot. Rather than expending energy on endless explanations, she redirected that energy into prayer, allowing God to fight her battles in the spiritual realm. The results were transformative. Within months, the very people who had been her strongest opponents either had a change of heart or removed themselves from her sphere of influence. Her workplace atmosphere shifted dramatically, not because she won arguments, but because she chose strategic silence. This brings us to a crucial understanding. Silence isn't passive. It's one of the most active spiritual positions you can take. When you choose not to defend yourself to people operating under demonic influence, you're actually engaging in high-level spiritual warfare. You're declaring that your trust is not in your ability to explain yourself, but in God's ability to vindicate you. Think about David's response to Saul's accusations. Despite having multiple opportunities to defend himself, David chose to let his actions speak and trusted God with his reputation. This same principle applies in our modern context. Whether you're dealing with workplace conflicts, family misunderstandings, or ministry challenges, the power of strategic silence remains unchanged. The key is discernment. Not every situation calls for silence, but when you're dealing with people who consistently twist your words and show patterns of spiritual opposition, silence becomes your shield. It's not about being passive or allowing abuse. It's about engaging in battle at the right level. As we move forward in understanding the power of strategic silence, remember this: your words are pearls of great price. Not everyone deserves access to your explanations, and not every accusation requires your response. Sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is no statement at all. Now that we understand how to practically apply strategic silence in our daily battles, let's explore how this seemingly passive approach actually unleashes unprecedented spiritual power in your life. Part 5. The power of strategic silence. Have you ever wondered why Jesus remained silent before Pilate during the most crucial moments of his trial? What power could there be in choosing not to speak when faced with false accusations? And how does this ancient wisdom apply to your battles today? Let me take you back to that pivotal morning in Jerusalem where the fate of humanity hung in the balance. The air was thick with tension in Pilate's courtroom. Picture the scene: Jesus, the King of Kings, standing before the Roman governor, surrounded by a hostile crowd, thirsting for his blood. The accusations were flying like arrows, each one more venomous than the last. False witnesses contradicted each other, religious leaders spewed their jealous hatred, and the crowd's anger reached a fever pitch. Yet, in this chaos, something extraordinary happened. Matthew 27, 14 tells us, Jesus gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. This wasn't the silence of defeat or fear. No, this was the silence of absolute authority. Think about it. The one who spoke the universe into existence, who calmed storms with a word, who raised the dead with a command, chose to remain silent. This silence was so powerful that even Pilate, a man accustomed to breaking prisoners through interrogation, was astonished. He had seen countless accused men plead for their lives, desperately trying to explain themselves. But here stood someone different. Someone who understood that true power doesn't always need words to assert itself. But let's dig deeper into the historical context. In ancient Roman trials, silence was often interpreted as a sign of guilt. The accused were expected to defend themselves vigorously. Yet Jesus defied this cultural norm, demonstrating a higher wisdom. His silence wasn't just a personal choice. It was a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Isaiah 53:7. This strategic silence served multiple purposes. First, it prevented his words from being twisted and used against him. Remember how earlier in his ministry, the Pharisees had constantly tried to trap him with his own words. Second, it demonstrated his complete trust in the Father's plan. And third, perhaps most profoundly, it revealed the powerlessness of his accusers to compel him to speak. Consider Mary's silence at the tomb of Jesus. When others rushed to spread the news of the empty tomb, John's Gospel tells us that Mary stood silently weeping. In that silence, she encountered the risen Christ in a way that those who rushed to speak did not. Her silence created space for a divine encounter. This brings us to a crucial understanding. Silence isn't passive. It's one of the most active spiritual weapons we possess. When you choose silence in the face of accusation or misunderstanding, you're not retreating. You're advancing in the Spirit. You're declaring my vindication comes from God, not from my ability to explain myself. Think of David when faced with Shimei's curses, 2 Samuel 16. Instead of defending himself or retaliating, David remained silent, trusting God to handle his accusers. This silence wasn't weakness. It was profound strength. It was a declaration that he knew who he was and whose he was, regardless of what others said about him. In our modern context, this principle becomes even more powerful. In a world of social media where everyone feels compelled to explain, defend, and justify themselves instantly, strategic silence stands out like a lighthouse in a storm. It's not about being passive or letting others walk all over you. It's about choosing your battles wisely and understanding that not every accusation requires a response. Isaiah 30:15 reveals this profound truth. In quietness and trust shall be your strength. Notice the connection between quietness and strength. This isn't the quiet of weakness or defeat. It's the quiet of absolute confidence in God's ability to fight your battles. When you grasp this principle, something remarkable happens. You stop feeling the need to defend yourself to people who are spiritually unable to understand. You preserve your peace, protect your spiritual authority, and position yourself for God's vindication. Like Jesus before Pilate, your silence becomes a testimony more powerful than any words could be. Let me give you a modern parallel. Think of a master martial artist faced with a street brawler's challenges. The master doesn't need to prove their skill through words or rushed responses. Their silence and calm demeanor speak volumes about their confidence and capability. In the same way, your strategic silence in spiritual battles demonstrates your maturity and trust in God's defending power. As we transition to our conclusion, remember this. Your silence in the face of accusation isn't just about what you're not saying. It's about what you're declaring in the spirit realm. You're declaring that your trust is in God's vindication, not in your ability to explain yourself. You're demonstrating that your peace comes from a higher source than human understanding or approval. Conclusion: rising above the noise, As we come to the end of our journey today, let's reflect on a profound truth that has echoed through the ages. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. We've explored how Jesus demonstrated this divine wisdom, not just through his teachings, but through his actions, particularly in those crucial moments before Pilate when silence spoke louder than any defense could have. When silence spoke have. Remember, beloved, your battle isn't against flesh and blood. When you find yourself constantly explaining, defending, and justifying your actions to people who seem determined to misunderstand, pause and ask yourself, am I casting my pearls before those who cannot receive them? Is this truly my battle to fight? We've discovered that strategic silence isn't about weakness, it's about wisdom. It's about understanding, as Isaiah taught us, that in quietness and trust is your strength. Think about that for a moment. In a world that demands instant responses and constant explanations, you have permission to stand in holy silence, letting God be your defender. This message isn't just about keeping quiet. It's about rising above the noise of accusation, misunderstanding, and spiritual opposition. It's about preserving your peace, protecting your spiritual authority, and positioning yourself for divine vindication. As C.S. Lewis wisely noted, don't waste words on those who deserve your silence. I want to challenge you today. In the next week, when you face opposition or misunderstanding, try responding with strategic silence. Not the silence of fear or defeat, but the silence of spiritual authority. Watch how this changes the dynamic of your battles. Share your experiences with our community. What battles are you facing right now where strategic silence might be your most powerful weapon? Type wisdom in the comments if you're ready to implement this biblical principle in your life. Let's support each other in this journey of spiritual growth. For those wrestling with constant criticism or opposition, remember, Jesus himself chose silence in his most crucial moment. You're in good company when you choose to let your peace speak louder than your words. Before we part ways, I want to thank you for joining me in this exploration of biblical wisdom. If this message has touched your heart or opened your eyes to a new perspective, please consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into God's Word and its practical application in your life. Next week, we'll explore another powerful truth from Scripture that will transform how you navigate spiritual warfare. Until then, remember, your silence in the face of opposition isn't just about what you're not saying. It's about who you're trusting to speak for you. May God fill you with wisdom, peace, and discernment as you practice the power of strategic silence. Remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. God bless you, and I'll see you in our next exploration of biblical wisdom.